Hello guys, tonight, our stories are about the men who build empires on a foundation of lies, the architects of deception so vast and so convincing that they manage to fool the entire world. We'll begin with the story of a man who was not a king or a general, but in the world of high finance, he was something close to a god. He was a pioneer of the modern stock market, a former chairman of the Nasdaq, a titan of Wall Street whose name was a synonym for wisdom, stability, and success. He was a quiet, unassuming man from Queens who became a living legend, the trusted steward of fortunes for charities, movie stars, and ordinary people alike. But behind the mask of the financial genius was a secret so simple and so catastrophic it would become the single largest act of fraud ever committed by one individual. His name was Bernard L. Madoff. Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to think about the nature of trust, especially when it comes to the things we hold most dear. Our savings, our security, our plans for the future. Think about the peace of mind that comes from placing that trust in the hands of an expert, a figure of unimpeachable authority. Now, imagine discovering that the entire foundation of that trust was nothing more than a phantom, a story told by the most convincing liar the world has ever known. It's a comfort to know we can explore these dark chapters together. A quiet community gathering from all corners of the globe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's enter the hushed, wood-paneled offices of Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, and the story of the man who stole the world. Bernie Madoff and the Great Deception. Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities LLC was, for decades, a name that commanded an almost religious reverence in the world of finance. It was an institution that seemed to exist above the vulgar, chaotic fray of Wall Street. Housed in the Lipstick Building, a sleek, elliptical skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan, the firm occupied two distinct floors, a physical separation that perfectly mirrored the two realities of Bernie Madoff's life. On the 18th and 19th floors was the legitimate, groundbreaking business, a market-making firm. Madoff was a true pioneer in this field. He had been one of the first to champion and utilize the electronic trading that would eventually become the Nasdaq stock market, a system that democratized trading and broke the stranglehold of the old boys club at the New York Stock Exchange. This legitimate business was innovative, successful, and hugely profitable. It was the source of Madoff's immense wealth and, more importantly, his unimpeachable reputation. He was not just another trader. He was an architect of the modern market, a former chairman of the Nasdaq, a wise elder statesman of finance. But on the 17th floor, separated by a floor and a world of secrecy, was his other business. This was his private investment and wealth management arm, a boutique operation that was, by design, shrouded in mystery and exclusivity. To be invited to invest with Bernie Madoff was to be welcomed into the most exclusive club in the financial world. He didn't advertise. He didn't solicit clients. You had to be introduced to be brought into the fold by someone who was already there. His clientele was a who's who of the wealthy and the powerful. Hollywood celebrities like Steven Spielberg and Kevin Bacon, real estate moguls, banking executives, and the scions of old money families. But he also managed the money for countless ordinary people, retirees, small business owners, and middle-class families who had entrusted him with their life savings. And, most tragically, he became the trusted steward for numerous charitable foundations, universities, and Jewish organizations, including that of his friend and fellow philanthropist, Elie Wiesel, the famed Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate. The allure of Madoff's investment fund was not its spectacular gains, but its almost supernatural consistency. In a world of volatile market swings, of booms and busts, Bernie Madoff offered a miracle. Steady, reliable, positive returns, year after year, like clockwork. Whether the market was soaring or crashing, his clients would receive their statements showing returns of around 10 to 12% per year. It was never too high to be unbelievable, but it was never, ever down. For his clients, this was the holy grail of investing. It was security. It was peace of mind. Investing with Bernie was like putting your money in the world's most exclusive and high-yielding savings account. He was seen not as a risk-taker, but as a financial wizard a man who had figured out a secret proprietary strategy that allowed him to defy the laws of financial gravity. The strategy he claimed to be using was called a split-strike conversion. It was a complex options trading strategy that was, in theory, designed to provide modest, consistent returns while limiting downside risk. When people asked for details, he would be vague, brushing off their inquiries with the quiet confidence of a genius who doesn't have the time or the inclination to explain his complex work to the uninitiated. The paperwork his clients received seemed to support this story. They would get regular, detailed statements showing dozens of trades in blue-chip stocks and options, all seemingly executed with flawless timing. The statements looked perfect. They were printed on high-quality paper, the numbers were all in order, and the profits were always there. But it was all a lie. A single, colossal, and breathtakingly audacious lie. There was no secret strategy. There were no trades. The split-strike conversion was a fiction, a complex-sounding piece of jargon designed to create an illusion of sophistication. The bustling investment advisory business on the 17th floor, the source of his legend, was a complete and total fraud. The reality was almost laughably simple. When a client gave Bernie Madoff their money, he did not invest it. He simply deposited it into a single, massive bank account at JP Morgan Chase. That was it. When a client wanted to withdraw some of their money, he would simply take the money from that same account, money that had been deposited by another, newer investor, and give it to them. The entire multi-billion-dollar operation was nothing more than a classic Ponzi scheme, the oldest and simplest financial fraud in the book, just executed on a scale that was almost impossible to comprehend. The detailed trading statements his clients received were pure fiction, fantasy documents created after the fact. Madoff and his trusted lieutenant, a man named Frank DePascali, would look at the historical stock data for a given period, pick the best-performing stocks, and then create fake, backdated trade confirmations to prove that they had bought and sold them at the perfect times. The entire operation on the 17th floor was a Potemkin village, a stage set designed to look like a legitimate investment firm, staffed by a small, loyal group of employees who were either complicit in the fraud or deliberately kept in the dark. Their only job to print and mail the fake statements that kept the illusion alive. For decades, this simple, monstrous lie worked perfectly. Madoff's reputation was his shield. He was the man who helped create the Nasdaq, a regulator, a philanthropist. He was too respected, too successful, too much a part of the system to ever be suspected of being a common crook. His air of exclusivity was a brilliant piece of reverse psychology. By making it difficult to invest with him, he made everyone want to. People would beg their friends for an introduction, feeling a sense of profound privilege when they were finally allowed to hand over their life savings to the quiet, unassuming wizard in the lipstick building. They were not just investing their money. They were investing their trust in the man himself, a man who had become a living symbol of financial integrity and security. And for decades, that trust was rewarded with the steady, comforting illusion of success, an illusion that would continue until the very foundations of the global economy began to crack, and the man who seemed to defy gravity was finally brought crashing down to earth. For nearly 2 decades, Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme operated with a smoothness that was both breathtaking and deeply unnerving. He was a master of his own mythology, projecting an aura of quiet competence and unassailable integrity that deflected any serious scrutiny. But even the most perfect illusion can develop cracks. And as the years went on, a small number of people in the financial world began to look at Madoff's miraculous returns not with reverence, but with a deep and growing suspicion. The numbers, they realized, were simply too good to be true. The first and most persistent voice in this wilderness of doubt belonged to a man named Harry Markopolos. Markopolos was a Boston-based financial analyst and a quantitative derivatives expert, a man whose job was to understand the complex world of options trading that Madoff claimed to have mastered. In 1999, his boss asked him to try and reverse engineer Madoff's split-strike conversion strategy to see if they could replicate his incredible results. Markopolos, a brilliant but prickly and obsessive analyst, dove into the numbers. It took him 5 minutes to know it was a fraud. It took him 4 hours to prove it. He realized that Madoff's stated strategy simply could not generate the returns he was claiming. For Madoff to be executing the sheer volume of options trades he reported on his statements, he would have had to be trading more options on certain stocks than actually existed in the entire global market. The split strike strategy itself was a real but very conservative strategy. It could protect against losses, but it could not generate the kind of consistent, positive returns Madoff was delivering, especially in down markets. Furthermore, Madoff's returns had a strange, almost unnatural smoothness. They never had a big up month, and they never had a down month. They just plodded along, a steady, unwavering 1% a month. Markopoulos, a man who lived and breathed market volatility, knew that this was a statistical impossibility. No real trading strategy, no matter how brilliant, could ever produce such a perfectly linear result. The market was a raging river of chaos. Madoff's returns were like a placid, man-made canal. Convinced he had uncovered the biggest fraud in Wall Street history, Markopoulos took his findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the primary regulatory body for the financial industry. He presented them with a detailed, scathing, and mathematically airtight case against Madoff. But the SEC, the watchdog that was supposed to protect investors, did nothing. They were intimidated by Madoff's immense reputation. He was a former chairman of the Nasdaq, a respected industry insider who had helped build the very system they were supposed to be policing. The idea that he could be a common fraudster was, to them, unthinkable. For the next 8 years, Harry Markopoulos became a man obsessed. He continued his research, gathering more evidence and refining his arguments. He submitted his findings to the SEC 4 more times between 2000 and 2008. Each submission was more detailed, more urgent, and more damning than the last. He titled his final 2005 submission simply, "The world's largest hedge fund is a fraud." He pointed out that Madoff's accounting firm was a tiny, 3-person operation in a strip mall outside of New York City, a comically inadequate auditor for a multi-billion-dollar investment fund. He noted that Madoff refused to allow any outside oversight and kept his operations shrouded in an almost cult-like secrecy. He practically laid the entire fraud at the feet of the regulators, but each time, he was met with bureaucratic indifference and inaction. The SEC conducted several cursory investigations into Madoff's firm over the years, but they were half-hearted and easily deflected by Madoff's charm and his mountain of fabricated documents. He was a master at giving the appearance of transparency while revealing nothing. While Markopoulos was waging his lonely war against the SEC, Madoff's empire continued to grow. The 2000s were a boom time for Wall Street, and more money poured into his fund. He became even more of a legend, a safe harbor in the increasingly volatile world of high finance. He brought his own family into the business. His 2 sons, Mark and Andrew Madoff, worked on the legitimate 19th floor market-making side of the business. His brother, Peter, was the firm's chief compliance officer. They were all, by their later accounts, completely unaware of the massive fraud being perpetrated just 1 floor below them, a fraud that was being run by their own father and a small, fiercely loyal cadre of employees on the secret 17th floor. The engine of this massive deception was new money. Like any Ponzi scheme, Madoff's firm required a constant inflow of new capital to pay off the returns of the existing investors. For decades, he had no problem attracting this new money. His reputation and the allure of his exclusive fund were all the marketing he needed. But in the autumn of 2008, the music stopped. The global financial crisis, triggered by the collapse of the subprime mortgage market, sent a tidal wave of panic through the world's economies. The stock market plummeted, credit markets froze, and investors everywhere, terrified of losing everything, made a mad dash for cash. For Bernie Madoff, this was a cataclysm. His clients, who for years had been content to let their profits roll over, now wanted their money back. A wave of redemption requests, totaling over $7 billion, hit his firm, but the money wasn't there. The massive account at JP Morgan Chase, the central hub of his entire operation, was rapidly being depleted. The constant flow of new money that was the lifeblood of his scheme had dried up completely. There was no one left to fool. The pyramid was collapsing in on itself. In the first week of December 2008, the reality of the situation became undeniable. Bernie Madoff, the man who had been the picture of calm, unflappable confidence for half a century, was out of time, out of money, and out of lies. The greatest financial deception in history was just hours away from imploding. He knew he was finished. He gathered his two sons, Mark and Andrew, in his apartment for a meeting. They came expecting to discuss the year-end bonuses for their employees. But the conversation their father was about to have with them would not be about bonuses. It would be a confession, a revelation so monstrous and so complete that it would destroy their family, their reputations, and the lives of thousands of people around the world. The wizard was finally about to pull back the curtain and reveal that his entire kingdom was nothing more than an illusion. On the afternoon of Wednesday, December 10th, 2008, Mark and Andrew Madoff arrived at their father's lavish penthouse apartment on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The mood was tense. The global financial system was in freefall, and their firm, like every other on Wall Street, was facing unprecedented pressure. They were there to discuss the annual employee bonuses, a conversation that was already fraught with anxiety. But the news their father was about to deliver was infinitely worse than a disappointing bonus season. Bernie Madoff sat his two sons down. He was, for the first time in their lives, visibly distraught. His usual mask of serene confidence completely gone. He began to speak, his voice heavy with the weight of a 50-year lie. He told them that the investment advisory side of the business, the legendary wealth management firm on the 17th floor that was the source of his fame and their family's immense fortune, was a fraud. He explained that it had all been one big lie. There were no trades. There were no investments. There was no split-strike conversion strategy. It was all just a massive, intricate Ponzi scheme. He told them he was finished, that he had absolutely nothing, and that the firm was insolvent. He estimated the losses to be in the range of $50 billion. The revelation was a psychological bomb that detonated in the middle of the Madoff family. Mark and Andrew were stunned. Their entire reality, their entire sense of who their father was and what their family stood for, shattered in an instant. They had spent their entire careers working at his firm, but they had been rigorously segregated on the legitimate 18th and 19th floors, running the profitable market-making business. They had always been puzzled by the secrecy of the 17th floor, but they had trusted their father, the man the entire world trusted. The idea that he was not a financial genius, but the architect of the largest fraud in history, was a truth so monstrous it was almost impossible to process. Bernie, in a final, delusional act of control, told his sons that he wanted one more week. He planned to spend the next few days distributing the remaining few $100 million in the firm's bank account to certain family members, friends, and longtime employees before he surrendered to the authorities. His sons, horrified and disgusted by the idea of distributing stolen money, refused. They left their father's apartment, walked a few blocks away, and consulted a lawyer. The lawyer's advice was unequivocal. They had to go to the authorities immediately. That night, they contacted the SEC and the U.S. Attorney's Office. The long-delayed alarm that Harry Markopolos had been trying to sound for nearly a decade was finally irrevocably pulled. The next morning, on December 11, 2008, two FBI agents arrived at Bernie Madoff's penthouse apartment. They asked him if there was an innocent explanation for the fact that his firm was insolvent and that he had been paying old investors with new investors' money. Madoff's response was simple and direct. "There is no innocent explanation," he said. He was arrested, handcuffed, and led out of his lavish apartment. A quiet, unassuming 70-year-old man in a bathrobe, the very picture of a fallen god. The news of his arrest spread through the financial world like a contagion. The initial reports were met with a sense of profound disbelief. Bernie Madoff? A fraud? It was impossible. He was the safest bet on Wall Street, the man who had built the NASDAQ, the bedrock of stability in a world of chaos. But as the details of the $50 billion Ponzi scheme emerged, disbelief turned to horror, and horror turned to a furious, global wave of rage and despair. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The list of his victims was a testament to the depth and breadth of his deception. It was not just the super-rich who were wiped out. Thousands of ordinary people, retirees who had entrusted him with their entire life savings, families who had saved for generations, woke up to find that they were completely, utterly broke. The charitable foundations that had been the lifeblood of so many communities were decimated. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity lost everything. Universities, hospitals, and cultural institutions saw their endowments vanish overnight. The ripple effect was global, touching communities in Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Madoff had not just stolen money. He had stolen futures, destroyed legacies, and shattered the very foundation of trust for thousands of people. The personal toll was just as devastating. The stories that emerged were heartbreaking. People who had lived lives of comfort and security were now facing foreclosure, poverty, and a future they had never imagined. The psychological impact was immense. At least 2 of his investors died by suicide in the immediate aftermath of the scandal. The sense of betrayal was profound. Madoff had not just been their financial advisor. He had been their friend, their neighbor, a member of their community. He had attended their weddings, their bar mitzvahs, their funerals. He had looked them in the eye and lied year after year, with a sociopathic calm that was almost impossible to comprehend. The investigation that followed was a massive effort to untangle the decades-long fraud and to try and recover whatever assets were left. The court-appointed trustee, Irving Picard, began the Herculean task of sifting through the wreckage. He discovered that the fraud was even more extensive than initially believed, with paper losses totaling over $65 billion. The process of clawing back money began, a controversial legal process where investors who had taken out more money from the fund than they had put in, the net winners, were sued to return their fictitious profits so that the money could be redistributed to the net losers. This process, while legally necessary, pitted victim against victim, turning friends and family members against each other and creating another layer of pain and acrimony. While the financial and legal battles raged, the focus also turned to the other members of the Madoff inner circle. Were his sons and his brother truly, as they claimed, completely ignorant of the massive fraud being conducted just one floor beneath them? Or were they complicit, willing participants in the family business? The question of who knew what and when became one of the most contentious and debated aspects of the entire saga. The Madoff name, once a symbol of trust and success, was now a mark of unparalleled infamy, a stain that would follow every member of the family for the rest of their lives. The House of Madoff had not just collapsed. It had imploded, leaving behind a crater of financial and emotional devastation that was global in its scale. The unraveling of Bernie Madoff's life was as swift and as total as the collapse of his fraudulent empire. In March of 2009, he pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies, including securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, perjury, and money laundering. He took full responsibility for the scheme, insisting in his allocution that he had acted alone and that his family had known nothing of his crimes. He never went to trial. By pleading guilty, he avoided having to publicly testify and be cross-examined, a final act of control that allowed him to keep many of the intimate details of his operation shrouded in mystery. The courtroom on the day of his sentencing was filled with his victims, many of whom gave powerful, emotional impact statements, describing in raw detail how he had destroyed their lives. Judge Denny Chin, in sentencing him, showed no mercy. He called Madoff's crimes extraordinarily evil and sentenced him to 150 years in federal prison, the maximum possible sentence. It was a symbolic sentence, designed to ensure that the 71-year-old Madoff would spend the rest of his natural life behind bars. He was sent to a medium-security federal prison in Butner, North Carolina, where he would transition from a titan of Wall Street to a simple inmate number. The fallout for the Madoff family was a long and public tragedy. While Bernie insisted on their innocence, the court of public opinion was far less forgiving. His sons, Mark and Andrew, were vilified, seen by many as either complicit co-conspirators or willfully ignorant beneficiaries of a massive fraud. They were the subjects of intense media scrutiny, lawsuits from the bankruptcy trustee, and a federal investigation that lasted for years. Though neither son was ever criminally charged, their lives were irrevocably destroyed. On the second anniversary of his father's arrest, in December of 2010, Mark Madoff, who had been struggling with the public shame and the legal battles, died by suicide in his Manhattan apartment. It was a tragic end for a man who had, by all credible accounts, been one of his father's greatest victims. His brother, Andrew, died of cancer 4 years later, in 2014, also maintaining his innocence to the end. Bernie's wife, Ruth, was stripped of most of her assets and forced to live a life of quiet, isolated shame. The family that had once been a symbol of American success had been utterly annihilated by the sins of its patriarch. Several of Madoff's key associates on the secret 17th floor were not so lucky. His right-hand man, Frank DePascali, who had been the chief architect of the fake trading statements, pleaded guilty and became a key cooperating witness for the government. He provided investigators with a detailed, insider's account of how the fraud was perpetrated. He died of cancer before he could be sentenced. Madoff's brother, Peter, also pleaded guilty to related charges and served a 10-year prison sentence. In the end, a total of 15 people, including accountants, programmers, and administrative staff, were convicted of crimes related to their role in facilitating the massive fraud. The Madoff scandal had a profound and lasting impact on the financial world. It was a catastrophic failure of regulation on every level. The SEC, in particular, was subjected to intense criticism and public humiliation. Harry Markopolos, the man who had tried to warn them for 8 years, became a folk hero, a testament to the power of a single, persistent voice against institutional blindness. The scandal led to a massive overhaul of the SEC's enforcement and inspection procedures, and a host of new financial regulations designed to prevent such a massive fraud from ever happening again. It exposed the deep, systemic weaknesses in a system that was built on a foundation of trust, a trust that Madoff had exploited with masterful skill. The case also serves as a timeless and terrifying study in the psychology of a sociopath. Bernie Madoff was not a wild-eyed radical or a violent criminal. He was a pillar of the community, a quiet, grandfatherly figure who was universally beloved and trusted, and it was this very mask of normalcy that was his greatest asset. He understood with a chilling, intuitive genius that if you could make people believe in you, the person, they would never question the numbers. He built a cult of personality around himself, and his investors were not just clients. They were his disciples. Their faith in him was so absolute that it blinded them to the countless red flags that, in retrospect, were so obvious. Bernie Madoff died in prison on April 14, 2021, at the age of 82. He took many of his secrets with him to the grave. We may never know the full, intimate details of how he managed to sustain such a massive lie for so long, or how he was able to so completely compartmentalize his life, deceiving even those closest to him. His name is now a permanent part of the English language, a synonym for fraud, deception, and betrayal on an epic scale. His story is a dark fable for the modern age. It is a story about the dangers of blind faith, the corrosive power of greed, and the terrifying reality that the greatest monsters are often not the ones who hide in the shadows, but the ones who stand in the brightest lights, smiling and promising to keep us safe. The empire of Bernie Madoff was a house of cards built on a single, massive deception. But some crimes are not so neat. They are chaotic, violent, and deeply personal, leaving behind a trail of physical evidence so strange and so brutal that it points not to a con man, but to a monster of a very different kind. The Watergate scandal. Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1972 was a city on a knife's edge. The nation was mired in the deep, divisive wounds of the Vietnam War, and a bitter presidential election was looming on the horizon. The incumbent Richard M. Nixon was a man who had built his entire political career on a foundation of fierce, almost paranoid ambition. He was a brilliant strategist, a master of political warfare who saw enemies everywhere and believed that victory, at any cost, was the only thing that mattered. His re-election campaign, run by a shadowy and fiercely loyal organization known as the Committee to Re-elect the President, or, with a chilling, unintentional irony, CREEP, was operating with an almost military-grade intensity, determined to secure a landslide victory and crush its political opponents. In this atmosphere of high-stakes political combat, the line between aggressive campaigning and criminal conspiracy was about to be crossed in a way that would ultimately bring a president and a nation's trust in its government to its knees. Our story begins not in the halls of the White House, but in the dark, silent corridors of a modern, sprawling complex of offices and luxury apartments that overlooked the Potomac River. The Watergate complex was a symbol of the new Washington, a place of power, wealth, and influence. And on the 6th floor of its office building was the national headquarters of the Democratic National Committee, the nerve center of the opposition party. In the pre-dawn hours of Saturday, June 17, 1972, a 24-year-old security guard named Frank Wills was making his routine rounds. It was a quiet, thankless job, a night of walking silent hallways and checking empty offices. But on this night, he noticed something strange. On the latch of a door leading from the basement parking garage to a stairwell, he found a small piece of duct tape, placed horizontally to prevent the lock from engaging. He assumed it was a maintenance worker who had forgotten to remove it. He peeled off the tape, ensured the door was locked, and continued on his rounds. A short time later, he passed the same door again. The tape was back. A cold chill of suspicion ran down his spine. This was not an accident. Someone had deliberately tampered with the lock. Someone was in the building who was not supposed to be there. Frank Wills returned to his security desk and made a phone call that would change the course of American history. He called the D.C. Metropolitan Police. 3 plainclothes officers from the 2nd District Tactical Squad responded to the call. They arrived at the Watergate in an unmarked car, not expecting much more than a routine burglary. They met with Wills, who showed them the taped lock. The officers, their senses now on high alert, began a slow, methodical, floor-by-floor search of the darkened office building. When they reached the 6th floor, the home of the DNC, they found another taped lock. They drew their pistols, entered the offices, and began to move through the darkened rooms. In a back office, they found them. 5 men, dressed in sharp business suits and wearing blue surgical gloves. They were caught in the act of trying to photograph documents and repair a bugging device they had planted weeks earlier. The scene was deeply, almost surreally, bizarre. These were not ordinary burglars. They were equipped with high-end cameras, walkie-talkies, lock-picking tools, and, most strangely, thousands of dollars in crisp, sequentially numbered $100 bills. When the police asked them for their names, they gave aliases. The men were arrested and taken to the police station. The initial police report would describe the crime with a now-famous phrase, a third-rate burglary. It seemed like a strange, clumsy, but ultimately minor local crime. But as the identities of the 5 men came to light, the story began to get much stranger. One of the burglars was a man named James W. McCord Jr. He was not a common criminal. He was the security coordinator for the committee to re-elect the president. He was also a former CIA agent. The other 4 men were all Cuban Americans from Miami, veterans of the CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion. These were not cat burglars. They were professional political operatives, men with deep ties to the world of intelligence and anti-Castro movements. What were they doing in the headquarters of the opposition party? The story of the strange Watergate break-in was assigned to a young, tenacious, but relatively junior reporter at the Washington Post named Bob Woodward. It was considered a local crime story, not a major political scoop. Woodward, attending the burglars' arraignment, noticed that one of them whispered the name Howard Hunt to his lawyer. Woodward began to dig. He discovered that E. Howard Hunt was a former high-ranking CIA officer who was now working as a consultant at the White House for a man named Charles Colson, one of President Nixon's most trusted and feared special counsels. The connection, however tenuous, was explosive. A direct line had just been drawn from a third-rate burglary to the inner sanctum of the Nixon White House. Woodward was soon partnered with another young reporter at the Post, Carl Bernstein. Bernstein was Woodward's opposite in many ways. Where Woodward was a quiet, Yale-educated Republican, Bernstein was a brash, long-haired college dropout with a reputation for brilliant but chaotic reporting. Together, they formed one of the most famous and effective partnerships in the history of American journalism. They began to pull on the thread that connected the burglars to the White House, and with each tug, the entire vast conspiracy began to slowly, painstakingly unravel. The White House, for its part, immediately went into damage control mode. The president's press secretary, Ron Ziegler, dismissed the incident as a caper, an absurd and isolated event that had no connection to the president or his re-election campaign. President Nixon himself, in a press conference a few days later, declared that no one in his administration, no one in the White House, was involved in this very bizarre incident. It was a lie, a bold and public deception that would be the first of many. While the White House was building a wall of denial, Woodward and Bernstein were beginning their relentless, shoe-leather investigation. They worked the phones, they knocked on doors, they tracked down reluctant and frightened sources. And Woodward had an ace up his sleeve, a source so secret and so high-level that his identity would remain one of Washington's greatest mysteries for 3 decades. The source, whom Woodward would nickname Deep Throat, was a man deep within the executive branch. They would meet in secret, in the dead of night in an underground parking garage. Deep Throat would never give Woodward new information, but he would confirm the leads the reporters were already chasing, and he would guide their investigation with cryptic but powerful advice. His most famous piece of counsel would become the motto for the entire investigation: follow the money. And it was the money that would ultimately provide the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy, a trail of laundered campaign funds that led directly from the burglars' pockets to the highest levels of the committee to re-elect the president, and ultimately to the Oval Office itself. The third-rate burglary was about to become the greatest political scandal in American history. Following the advice of their secret source, Deep Throat, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein began to meticulously trace the path of the money found on the Watergate burglars. It was a journey into a shadowy world of secret bank accounts, laundered funds, and a vast, illegal slush fund controlled by the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP. They discovered that the crisp, sequential $100 bills were just the tip of the iceberg. There was a secret fund, controlled by senior officials at CREEP, that had been used to finance not just the Watergate break-in, but a wide-ranging campaign of political espionage and sabotage against all of President Nixon's potential Democratic rivals. This was not just about one burglary. It was about a systematic effort to undermine the entire democratic process. Woodward and Bernstein, through a combination of relentless investigative work and confirmations from Deep Throat, began to publish a series of explosive articles in the Washington Post. They revealed that the Watergate break-in was part of a larger Dirty Tricks campaign. They uncovered stories of forged letters, fake press releases, and hired spies who were sent to disrupt the campaigns of Democratic candidates. They reported that the Attorney General of the United States, John Mitchell, who had been the head of CREEP before resigning to run the campaign, had personally controlled the secret fund from which the burglars were paid. The White House, led by President Nixon, responded to these revelations with a coordinated and vicious counterattack. They denied everything. They accused the Washington Post and its reporters of engaging in a politically motivated smear campaign, of using shabby journalism and hearsay to attack the president. The administration's powerful figures like Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman and Chief Domestic Advisor John Ehrlichman, a duo known as the Berlin Wall for their role in isolating the president, publicly and privately sought to discredit the reporters and their publisher, Katharine Graham. It was an all-out war between the most powerful office in the world and a single newspaper. For months, Woodward and Bernstein were isolated, their stories largely ignored by the rest of the national media, who were content to accept the White House's denials. But behind the scenes, a different kind of war was being waged: the cover-up. Within days of the break-in, President Nixon and his closest aides began a systematic and illegal effort to obstruct the FBI's investigation. This conspiracy, which was far more serious than the initial burglary, was the true heart of the Watergate scandal. They destroyed documents, they lied to investigators, and they used the power of the White House to try and shut down the inquiry. One of the most audacious acts of obstruction involved the CIA. Nixon and Haldeman hatched a plan to have the CIA intervene with the FBI, claiming that the Watergate investigation was in danger of exposing sensitive, national security-related covert operations in Mexico, where some of the burglars' money had been laundered. It was a complete fabrication, a cynical attempt to use the cloak of national security to hide a domestic political crime. The acting director of the FBI at the time, L. Patrick Gray, was pressured to limit the scope of his investigation. The cover-up was initially successful. The investigation was contained, and in the fall of 1972, President Nixon was re-elected in one of the most lopsided landslides in American history, carrying 49 of the 50 states. It seemed as though he had weathered the storm. The Watergate story, which had been a minor blip on the political radar, seemed to be fading away. In January of 1973, the 5 burglars and their 2 direct supervisors, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, went on trial. Liddy and one of the burglars pleaded guilty. The others were quickly convicted. They all remained silent about who had ordered the break-in, content to be seen as loyal soldiers falling on their swords. The judge, a tough, skeptical jurist named John J. Sirica, was not convinced. He believed that the men were part of a larger conspiracy and that they were being pressured to keep quiet. At their sentencing, he handed down unusually long, provisional sentences, making it clear that he would consider reducing them if the men chose to cooperate with the ongoing investigations. Judge Sirica's pressure began to work. One of the burglars, James McCord, the former security chief for Creep, broke his silence. He wrote a letter to Judge Sirica, a bombshell in which he alleged that he and the other defendants had committed perjury during their trial, that they had been paid hush money by high-level officials, and that powerful figures in the White House had been involved in planning the break-in. McCord's letter was the first crack in the wall of silence, and it soon became a flood. The Senate, which had been conducting its own quiet investigation, voted to form a special committee to investigate the Watergate affair. The Senate Watergate Committee, led by the folksy but shrewd Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, began to hold televised hearings in the spring of 1973. The Watergate hearings were a national phenomenon, a piece of political theater that captivated the country for an entire summer. One by one, a parade of White House and campaign officials were brought before the committee to testify under oath, their testimony broadcast live into the living rooms of America. The hearings revealed the inner workings of the Nixon White House, a world of paranoia, enemies lists, and a win-at-all-costs mentality. The most stunning testimony came from a young White House counsel named John Dean. Dean, who had been at the center of the cover-up, decided to cooperate with the prosecution to save himself. In a week of riveting testimony, he laid out the entire conspiracy in meticulous detail. He testified that there had been a cancer on the presidency, and he directly implicated the president's closest aides, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and even the former Attorney General, John Mitchell. And most explosively, he testified that he believed President Nixon himself had been aware of the cover-up. Dean's testimony was a direct assault on the president, but it was still his word against the word of the most powerful man in the world. The White House vehemently denied his account, painting him as a disgruntled liar. The case had become a high-stakes game of he said, he said. The country was faced with a constitutional crisis of unprecedented proportions. And then, during the testimony of a low-level White House aide named Alexander Butterfield, the Watergate Committee would ask a single, almost routine question that would change everything and reveal the existence of a secret that would ultimately bring down a presidency. The cancer on the presidency was about to metastasize, and the proof was hidden on a series of secret audio tapes. The testimony of John Dean before the Senate Watergate Committee had created a constitutional firestorm. He had directly implicated President Nixon in a criminal cover-up, but it was his word against the president's. The investigation was at a stalemate, a high-stakes standoff with no clear path to the truth. Then, on July 16, 1973, during a routine staff interview, a minority counsel for the Senate committee asked a fateful question of a White House aide named Alexander Butterfield. The question was simple. Was there any kind of recording system in the Oval Office? Butterfield, under oath, gave a reluctant but truthful answer. His response was a bombshell that would detonate at the heart of the presidency and change the course of American history. "I was hoping you wouldn't ask that," he said, before revealing that, yes, President Nixon had a secret, voice-activated taping system that recorded every single conversation that took place in the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, and his private office in the old Executive Office building. The revelation was stunning. A secret, comprehensive record of every conversation the president had had for the past 2 years actually existed. The he said stalemate was over. The truth was not a matter of one man's word against another's. It was on tape. The tapes instantly became the central focus of the entire Watergate investigation. They were the potential smoking gun, the one piece of evidence that could either definitively prove the president's involvement in the cover-up or completely exonerate him. The battle for the tapes began immediately. The Senate Watergate Committee, led by Senator Sam Ervin, and the newly appointed Watergate Special Prosecutor, a former Solicitor General named Archibald Cox, both issued subpoenas for the tapes. They demanded that the White House turn over the recordings of the specific conversations that John Dean had testified about. President Nixon, however, refused. He invoked the doctrine of executive privilege, claiming that a president's private conversations were confidential and that their release would damage the integrity and functioning of the presidency. He argued that he and he alone had the right to decide what could be released. This set the stage for a monumental constitutional battle between the executive branch and the legislative and judicial branches of government. The case went to the courts. As the legal battle raged, the pressure on the White House intensified. The Watergate hearings continued to uncover more evidence of wrongdoing. Key aides like H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman were forced to resign. The president's approval ratings plummeted. The country was in the grip of a constitutional crisis. In October of 1973, the crisis reached its boiling point in an event that would become known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The courts had ruled against the president, ordering him to turn over the tapes to the special prosecutor. Nixon, in a desperate act of defiance, refused. Instead, he offered a compromise. He would provide edited transcripts of the tapes, which he would personally review and approve. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox rejected the offer, insisting on the original, unedited tapes. He announced that he would continue to press his case in court. Nixon, furious at this act of defiance from within his own Justice Department, decided to fire Cox. On the evening of Saturday, October 20th, he ordered his Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire the special prosecutor. Richardson, a man of principle, refused the direct order and resigned in protest. Nixon then ordered the Deputy Attorney General, William Ruckelshaus, to fire Cox. He too refused and was fired. Finally, Nixon went to the third-ranking official in the Justice Department, the Solicitor General, a man named Robert Bork. Bork, believing that the president had the legal authority to fire the special prosecutor, carried out the order. The Saturday Night Massacre was a political firestorm. The image of a president firing the very man who was investigating him was seen by the public as a blatant and shocking abuse of power. The outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Members of Congress from both parties were inundated with furious telegrams and phone calls from their constituents. For the first time, the talk of impeachment, which had been a whisper on the political fringes, became a real and powerful possibility. Faced with this massive public and political backlash, Nixon was forced to retreat. He agreed to appoint a new special prosecutor, a respected Houston lawyer named Leon Jaworski, and he promised that Jaworski would have the independence to continue the investigation. He also agreed to turn over some of the subpoenaed tapes. But when the White House finally handed over the first batch of recordings, the investigation was met with another stunning and suspicious revelation. One of the most crucial conversations, a discussion between Nixon and H.R. Haldeman that had occurred just 3 days after the Watergate break-in, was missing. The tape, the White House counsel explained, had an 18.5-minute gap. The president's longtime, loyal secretary, Rosemary Woods, offered a bizarre and almost comical explanation. She claimed that she had been transcribing the tape and had accidentally erased the section when she had reached for the telephone, her foot remaining on the pedal of the transcription machine. This Rosemary stretch, as it was dubbed by the press, was met with widespread ridicule and disbelief. To the investigators and the public, the 18.5-minute gap was not an accident. It was a deliberate act of destruction of evidence, a sign that the conversation on that tape contained something so damning that the president was willing to risk a charge of obstruction of justice to keep it hidden. The battle for the remaining tapes continued. Special Prosecutor Jaworski issued new subpoenas for more recordings. And again, Nixon refused, citing executive privilege. The case once again went to the courts, this time making its way all the way to the highest court in the land. In the summer of 1974, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a unanimous 8-0 decision in the case of United States versus Nixon, delivered a historic and definitive ruling. They ruled that while the concept of executive privilege was valid, It was not absolute, and it could not be used to shield evidence in a criminal investigation. The president, the court declared, was not above the law. They ordered him to turn over the unedited tapes. For Richard Nixon, it was the final, fatal blow. He had run out of legal options, out of political capital, and out of time. He knew what was on those tapes. He knew that they contained the smoking gun, the undeniable proof of his direct involvement in the cover-up. The wall of denial he had so carefully constructed for 2 years was about to come crashing down. The end of his presidency was now not a matter of if, but when. The tapes would finally speak, and their story would be one of a president's own words sealing his own fate. The Supreme Court's unanimous decision was a death knell for the Nixon presidency. On July 24, 1974, Richard Nixon, his legal options exhausted, was forced to comply. He began the process of turning over the remaining subpoenaed tapes to the Special Prosecutor's Office. At the same time, the House Judiciary Committee, which had been conducting its own impeachment inquiry, was moving forward. After reviewing the evidence, including the testimony from the Senate hearings and the newly released tapes, the committee voted to approve 3 articles of impeachment against the president. They charged him with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. A full impeachment vote by the House of Representatives was now a certainty, and conviction in the Senate seemed increasingly likely. The final, fatal blow came with the release of the tape that would become known as the smoking gun. The recording was of a conversation that had taken place in the Oval Office on June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the Watergate break-in. On the tape, President Nixon could be heard explicitly ordering his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation into the burglary. It was the undeniable audio-recorded proof of the cover-up, a direct link from the president himself to the illegal obstruction of justice. It was the evidence that John Dean had spoken of, the proof that the president had been lying to the American people from the very beginning. The release of the smoking gun tape eviscerated what little political support Nixon had left. The Republican leaders in Congress, who had stood by him for so long, finally abandoned him. A delegation of senior Republican senators, led by Barry Goldwater, went to the White House and delivered the final, grim message. They told the president that his support in the Senate had collapsed and that his conviction and removal from office were now a virtual certainty. For Richard Nixon, the man who had fought his entire life for political survival, the battle was finally over. On the evening of August 8, 1974, he addressed the nation from the Oval Office. In a televised speech watched by millions, he announced his resignation. He never admitted to any criminal wrongdoing, stating only that he was resigning because he no longer had a strong enough political base in the Congress to continue his work. It was a carefully worded, defiant end to a presidency that had been defined by division and scandal. The next day, on August 9, 1974, Richard M. Nixon officially resigned the presidency of the United States. He boarded the Marine One helicopter on the White House lawn and, with his signature, 2-armed victory salute, flew away into a disgraced exile. His vice president, Gerald R. Ford, was sworn in as the 38th president, famously declaring in his inaugural address, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." But the nightmare, for many, was just beginning to be understood. The Watergate scandal was more than just a third-rate burglary. It was a profound and systemic abuse of power that had shaken the very foundations of American democracy. The legacy of the scandal was immense and far-reaching. It led to a wave of sweeping campaign finance reforms and new ethics laws designed to limit the power of money and secrecy in politics. It solidified the role of the press as a crucial fourth estate, a watchdog on government power, and turned Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein into journalistic legends, inspiring a generation of investigative reporters. One of the most significant and controversial chapters of the aftermath came just a month after Nixon's resignation. On September 8, 1974, President Gerald Ford granted Richard Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon for any and all crimes he may have committed while in office. Ford's decision was deeply controversial. He argued that it was a necessary act to heal a deeply divided nation and to move on from the trauma of Watergate. But to many, it was seen as a grave injustice, a final act of the cover-up that allowed the man at the center of the conspiracy to escape legal accountability for his crimes. The pardon would hang over Ford's own presidency and was likely a major factor in his election loss to Jimmy Carter in 1976. In the end, over 48 administration officials, including some of the most powerful men in the country, were convicted of crimes related to the Watergate scandal. H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, John Mitchell, and John Dean all served time in prison. The men who had surrounded the president, the architects of his political machine, were brought down by the very system they had sought to subvert. The identity of Deep Throat, Bob Woodward's secret source, remained one of Washington's most enduring mysteries for over 30 years. In 2005, his identity was finally revealed. He was W. Mark Felt, the former associate director of the FBI, the number 2 man in the bureau at the time of the scandal. Felt, it seemed, had been driven by a mixture of institutional loyalty to the FBI, which he felt was being corrupted by the White House, and a personal sense of being passed over for the top job by J. Edgar Hoover. His role as the secret informant made him a figure of both heroism and controversy. The Watergate scandal left a permanent scar on the American political landscape. It created a deep and lasting sense of cynicism and distrust in government that persists to this day. The suffix "gate" became a permanent part of the American lexicon, a shorthand for any political scandal, big or small. The story of Watergate is a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of unchecked power and the desperate lengths to which men will go to hold on to it. It is a story of a president's downfall, but it is also a testament to the resilience of American democratic institutions, a free press, an independent judiciary, and a Congress that, in the end, was willing to hold even the most powerful man in the world accountable. It is a story that began with a piece of tape on a door and ended with the resignation of a president. A dark and complex chapter that forever changed the relationship between the American people and the government they elect to serve them. The Watergate scandal was a crime of political power, a conspiracy that reached the highest office in the land. But some crimes are not born of political ambition. They are born of something far stranger, of a delusion so powerful that it can lead a group of ordinary people to believe they are on a mission from another world. A mission that ends in a bizarre and inexplicable death on a lonely hill. Heaven's Gate. The final exit. The history of American spirituality is a history of strange and fertile ground, a landscape where new religions can blossom and wither with the passing of a single season. The 1970s, in particular, were a time of profound spiritual searching and social upheaval. The certainties of the post-war era had crumbled, and a generation, disillusioned with mainstream religion and politics, began to look for answers in new, often unconventional, places. It was an era of gurus, of Eastern mysticism, of UFO contactees, and of a deep, pervasive belief that humanity was on the cusp of a great, evolutionary leap. It was in this chaotic, fertile soil of belief that 2 unlikely individuals would meet and, together, plant the seeds of a faith so bizarre, so total, and so ultimately tragic that it would end in a quiet, sterile mansion in Southern California, with 39 of its followers leaving the world behind in search of a spaceship hiding in the tail of a comet. The story of the group that would become known as Heaven's Gate begins with its 2 founders, the 2, as they would come to be known. They were a pair so strange and so seemingly mismatched that their meeting felt like an act of cosmic, if not comic, destiny. The first was Marshall Herff Applewhite. Born in Texas, Applewhite was a man of immense, almost theatrical charisma. He was a talented singer with a trained, resonant baritone voice, a former university music professor, and a man who had, for most of his life, tried and failed to fit into the conventional world. He had been married, had 2 children, and had pursued a career in academia, but he was plagued by a deep, internal turmoil over his sexuality and his place in the world. In the early 1970s, a profound personal and psychological crisis led to him being fired from his teaching position and briefly institutionalized. He was a man adrift, a charismatic vessel in search of a purpose. He found that purpose in a Houston hospital in 1972, where he met a 44-year-old nurse named Bonnie Lou Nettles. Nettles was a quiet, unassuming woman, a mother of 4 with a deep and abiding interest in the occult, theosophy, and biblical prophecy. She believed in spirit guides, reincarnation, and the possibility of communicating with beings from other dimensions. In the troubled, charismatic music professor, she saw not a patient, but a kindred spirit, a man of great destiny. And in her, Applewhite found a guide, a spiritual anchor who could give shape and meaning to his own confused and grandiose sense of self. Their connection was immediate and profound. They saw themselves as soulmates, as two beings who had been destined to meet across lifetimes. They soon abandoned their old lives completely. They left their families, their jobs, and their past identities behind. They embarked on a spiritual journey together, a nomadic existence spent wandering the American West. They began to synthesize their own unique theology, a bizarre and compelling hybrid of Christian apocalypticism, New Age mysticism, and 1970s science fiction. They came to believe that they were not human at all. They were extraterrestrial beings from a higher plane of existence, a place they called the next level or the evolutionary level above human. They believed they had been sent to Earth in human vehicles or containers on a divine mission. They were the two witnesses foretold in the book of Revelation, come to offer a final warning and a path to salvation before the earth was recycled or spaded under. They began to call themselves Bo and Peep, after the nursery rhyme characters, a playful name for two shepherds looking for their lost sheep. They began to hold small, informal meetings in living rooms and community halls across California and Oregon, putting up simple flyers that announced their message. A UFO from the next level was coming to take true believers away to the kingdom of heaven, and this was humanity's last chance to get on board. Their message, while bizarre, was deeply compelling to a certain kind of spiritual seeker. They were not wild-eyed, ranting prophets. They were calm, intelligent, and articulate. Applewhite, with his powerful, resonant voice and his intense, hypnotic gaze, was a captivating speaker. Nettles, the quieter, more maternal figure, provided a sense of stability and theological depth. They taught that the human body was merely a vessel, a container that one could learn to overcome through a process of intense spiritual discipline. They preached a message of absolute asceticism. To be ready for the spaceship, one had to completely shed all earthly attachments. Family, friends, possessions, money, and most importantly, human sexuality. They taught that the body and its desires were the primary obstacles to reaching the next level. In 1975, their small, wandering ministry exploded into the national consciousness. After a meeting in the small coastal town of Waldport, Oregon, a group of 20 people simply vanished, leaving behind their homes, their jobs, and their families to follow Bo and Peep. The event became a national news story, a strange tale of a UFO cult that had spirited away 24 ordinary people. The media attention brought a wave of new followers, but it also brought a level of scrutiny that the secretive group was not prepared for. For the next several years, the group, which now numbered in the hundreds, went underground. They became a nomadic, almost invisible community, constantly on the move, living in campgrounds across the American West. They were a world unto themselves, a class, as they called it, undergoing a rigorous and all-consuming spiritual training. Their lives were dictated by a complex set of rules and disciplines designed to break down their old, human identities and prepare them for their new, extraterrestrial existence. They adopted new, androgynous names, like Junity or Srodi, to shed their gendered, human identities. They wore matching, unisex uniforms of simple tracksuits and Nike sneakers. They cut their hair short, and they lived a life of absolute, monastic devotion to their two teachers, Bo and Peep. They were no longer individuals. They were a crew, a collective organism waiting for the arrival of their spaceship. The journey had begun, a long, strange trip that would lead them through decades of isolation, a series of evolving prophecies, and a final, fateful appointment with a comet named Hale-Bopp. The two shepherds had found their flock, and they were leading them on a path that would take them far beyond the confines of the known world. For the remainder of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, the group known to the world as the UFO cult, and known to its members as the class, lived a life of nomadic anonymity. They were a self-contained, mobile monastery, moving from campground to campground across the American West. their presence known only by the occasional strange news report of their quiet, disciplined existence. Life within the group was a rigorous and all-consuming process of deprogramming the self. Marshall Applewhite, Bo, and Bonnie Nettles, Peep, whom the group referred to as the Two, dictated every aspect of their followers' lives. Their goal was to completely erase the human from their vehicles, to prepare their consciousnesses for the transition to the next level. The rules were extensive and absolute. Members were required to sever all contact with their families and friends on the outside. Personal possessions were surrendered. They adopted new, two-syllable names ending in "odi", like Cody or Junity, to further break down their old identities. They followed a strict, ascetic diet and a rigid daily schedule of chores and lessons. But the central focus of their discipline was the complete and total suppression of all human, mammalian behaviors, particularly sexuality. Applewhite and Nettles taught that the human body was merely a temporary container, and that its desires for food, for comfort, for emotional connection, and especially for sexual contact, were the primary obstacles to spiritual evolution. These desires were seen as the manipulative programming of malevolent, spacefaring aliens they called Luciferians, who were trying to keep humanity trapped in a cycle of fleshly indulgence. To reach the next level, one had to achieve a state of complete androgynous neutrality. This obsession with overcoming sexuality would become one of the defining and most extreme aspects of the group's ideology. Several of the male members, including Applewhite himself, would eventually travel to Mexico to undergo voluntary surgical castration in a final, desperate attempt to conquer their human impulses. This period of wandering and intense discipline came to a sudden and catastrophic halt in 1985. Bonnie Nettles, Peep, the quieter, more grounding force of the two, was diagnosed with cancer. This presented a profound theological crisis for the group. How could a being from the next level, an advanced extraterrestrial in a human container, succumb to a simple human disease? Applewhite and Nettles explained it to their followers as a final test, a process through which Nettles would leave her vehicle and return to the next level in her true, disembodied form. She died in a Dallas hospital in 1985. Her followers were told that she had not died, but had simply graduated, leaving her physical container behind to continue her work from the spaceship that was waiting for them. The death of Bonnie Nettles had a profound and transformative effect on Marshall Applewhite. He was now alone, the sole remaining prophet on Earth. He had lost his spiritual partner, the yin to his yang, the person who had first helped him to understand his own divine mission. His grief and his sense of cosmic loneliness seemed to deepen his own messianic convictions. He was no longer just Bo, one of the two. He was now Do, pronounced Do, like a note on the musical scale. The sole, undisputed leader of the group, the final messenger. His teachings became more focused, more urgent, and more apocalyptic. The window for humanity to join them, he taught, was rapidly closing. In the early 1990s, after years of living in near-total seclusion, Applewhite, now Do, decided it was time for the group to reemerge. They needed to make one final attempt to reach the outside world, to offer humanity its last chance for salvation. And they would do so using a new and revolutionary tool, the Internet. The group, which had always been paradoxically tech-savvy despite their anti-technology rhetoric, established a new, more settled existence. They supported themselves by forming a successful web design company called Higher Source. They were good at it. They designed websites for local businesses, country clubs, and even a San Diego-based Christian organization. They were known for their professionalism, their discipline, and their strange, uniform appearance. Their clients had no idea that the quiet, polite people building their websites believed they were aliens waiting for a spaceship. The Internet was more than just a source of income. It was the perfect medium for their final message. They created a website, a stark, text-heavy portal to their bizarre and complex cosmology. The website, which is still active today, is a labyrinth of their teachings, a collection of their final exit statements, and a detailed explanation of their beliefs. They also began to place advertisements in newspapers like USA Today, Cryptic, full-page ads that announced the imminent return of the next level and the closing of the human kingdom. It was during this period, in the mid-1990s, that the final piece of their eschatological puzzle fell into place. In 1995, astronomers discovered a new, incredibly bright comet hurtling towards the inner solar system. It was named Comet Hale-Bopp. For most of the world, it was a beautiful and exciting astronomical event. But for Marshall Dew Applewhite and his followers, it was something more. It was a sign. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy. They became convinced that a massive spaceship, the vehicle from the next level that they had been waiting for over 2 decades, was hiding in the bright, gaseous tail of the comet. This belief was bolstered by a controversial photograph taken by an amateur astronomer, which seemed to show a strange, Saturn-like object trailing the comet, while professional astronomers quickly dismissed the object as a simple photographic anomaly. For Heaven's Gate, it was the final, irrefutable proof they had been waiting for. The time was at hand. The comet was their chariot. Their long, strange journey was about to come to an end. Their graduation from the human level was imminent. All that was left was to prepare for their final, meticulously planned exit, an act that would take them out of their human vehicles and onto the spaceship that was waiting for them in the heavens. The countdown had begun. The arrival of Comet Hale-Bopp in the Earth's skies in late 1996 and early 1997 was, for the members of Heaven's Gate, the final, unambiguous signal they had been waiting for more than 2 decades. Their father, Dew, taught them that the spaceship hidden in the comet's tail was their ride home, the vessel that would transport their consciousnesses from their temporary human containers to the evolutionary level above human. The time for their long-awaited graduation was at hand. A palpable sense of excitement, purpose, and serene finality settled over the group. Their long, arduous journey of discipline and self-denial was about to be rewarded. In the final months of 1996, the group made its last move. They rented a sprawling, 9,200-square-foot mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, an exclusive, sun-drenched suburb of San Diego, California. The house was a monument to the very earthly success they claimed to despise. A luxurious villa with a swimming pool, a tennis court, and sweeping views of the surrounding hills. But for them, it was not a home. It was a classroom, a monastery, and a launch pad. It was from this place that they would make their final exit. Life inside the Rancho Santa Fe mansion was a picture of calm, disciplined, and methodical preparation. The 39 members who remained with Applewhite were a diverse group, ranging in age from their 20s to their 70s, but they functioned as a single, cohesive unit. Their days were a highly structured routine of chores, web design work for their higher source business, and long sessions of study, where they would review Dew's videotaped lectures and discuss the finer points of their complex theology. They were a family, a crew preparing for the most important journey of their lives. As Comet Hale-Bopp grew brighter in the night sky, their preparations took on a new urgency. They began to meticulously plan every single detail of their exit. This was not to be a chaotic, emotional act of self-destruction. In their minds, it was a logical, necessary, and dignified procedure, a clinical shedding of their physical containers. They saw it not as suicide, but as a graduation, a willful and controlled transition to a higher state of being. They began to film what would become known as their exit tapes. In these videos, which are still available online, member after member sits in front of a plain backdrop and calmly, often cheerfully, explains their decision to leave. They are not depressed or desperate. They are bright, articulate, and filled with a serene, almost beatific, sense of joy. They speak of their love for Dew and Bonnie Nettles, and their profound excitement about finally returning to their true home. One member, a man named Thomas Nichols, the brother of the actress Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura in the original Star Trek series, smiles as he says, "I'm the happiest person in the world." Another member jokes, "We've been looking forward to this for so long." The videos are a deeply unsettling portrait of a group of people who have so completely embraced a shared delusion that they are walking towards their own deaths with the joyful anticipation of a long-awaited holiday. Marshall Dew Applewhite himself recorded a final, chilling message. In the video, he sits in a chair, his eyes wide and intense, his gaze fixed on the camera. He speaks with the calm, resonant authority of a man who is absolutely convinced of his own divinity. He explains that the earth is about to be recycled and that their exit is a final, compassionate offer of escape. "We are about to return to whence we came," he says. "I can take you to a level above human. It is the only way to heaven." It is the final performance of a charismatic madman, a last, desperate recruitment pitch delivered from the edge of the abyss. In the final days of March 1997, as Comet Hale-Bopp reached its perihelion, its closest and brightest approach to Earth, the group put their meticulously planned exit into motion. The process was carried out in 3 distinct waves over a period of several days. This was done to ensure that each group could clean up after the previous one, maintaining a sense of order and dignity to the very end. The method they chose was a cocktail of phenobarbital, a powerful barbiturate, mixed with applesauce or pudding, followed by a chaser of vodka. To ensure the process was lethal, they would then tie plastic bags over their heads to induce asphyxiation. The first group of 15 members took the fatal mixture on March 24th. The next group of 15 followed suit on March 25th. The final group of 9, which included Applewhite himself, completed the process on March 26th. They went to their deaths with a level of care and ritualistic detail that is almost impossible to comprehend. Each member was dressed in their uniform, a simple, black tracksuit and a brand new pair of black and white Nike Decade sneakers. In their pockets, each member had a $5 bill and 3 quarters, a small, symbolic payment for any interplanetary tolls they might encounter. They were all lying peacefully in their own beds, mostly bunk beds that filled the mansion's many rooms. Each body was covered with a square, purple shroud. The scene they left behind was not one of chaos or violence, but of a quiet, sterile, and deeply unsettling order. They had not just ended their lives. They had staged their graduation, creating a final, bizarre tableau for the human world they were leaving behind. For a few days, the mansion in Rancho Santa Fe was silent. The only sign that anything was amiss was an update to the group's website. The homepage was changed to a stark, black screen with a single, chilling message in white text. "Hale-Bopp brings closure to Heaven's Gate. Our 22 years of classroom here on planet Earth is finally coming to conclusion, graduation, from the human evolutionary level. We are happily exiting this dead world." The final act of the drama was initiated by a former member of the group, a man named Rio D'Angelo. Applewhite had sent him a package a few days earlier, containing 2 videotapes and a letter. The letter instructed him that the exit had been a success and that he was now to share their final message with the world. On March 26th, after viewing the tapes, D'Angelo drove to the Rancho Santa Fe mansion. He couldn't bring himself to go inside. Instead, he called the police and, in a strained, emotional voice, told the dispatcher, "I think there's a mass suicide in this house." The San Diego County Sheriff's Department was about to walk into a scene that would shock the world and become a defining, tragic symbol of the strange power of cults and the dark side of the search for meaning. When deputies from the San Diego County Sheriff's Department entered the Rancho Santa Fe mansion on March 26, 1997, they were met not with the expected chaos of a mass casualty event, but with a scene of profound, almost monastic order. The house was immaculate. In the various bedrooms, they found the 39 bodies, 21 women and 18 men, lying peacefully in their beds. Each was dressed in their identical black uniform, their faces and torsos covered by the purple shrouds. The air was still and heavy, with no sign of a struggle, no sign of violence, only the quiet, sterile aftermath of a meticulously planned, collective departure. The discovery was a media bombshell. The story of the UFO suicide cult became a global sensation, a bizarre and tragic spectacle that captivated and horrified the world. The images from inside the mansion, the rows of bunk beds, the identical sneakers, the serene, shrouded bodies, were seared into the public consciousness. The case became a symbol of the dangers of cults, a cautionary tale about the power of a charismatic leader to lead their followers to a self-inflicted, delusional end. The investigation that followed was a straightforward, if surreal, affair. The cause of death was confirmed for all 39 members as a result of the phenobarbital and vodka cocktail, combined with asphyxiation. The deaths were all ruled as suicides. There was no evidence of coercion in the final moments. The exit tapes were a powerful testament to the fact that every member had gone to their death willingly, even joyfully. The case was, from a legal perspective, an open and shut matter. But the psychological and cultural questions it raised were far more complex and enduring. Who were the people who had made this final, fateful choice? The popular media narrative tended to portray them as weak-minded, uneducated cult members who had been brainwashed by a madman. But the reality was far more nuanced. The members of Heaven's Gate were, for the most part, intelligent, well-educated, and deeply sincere individuals. The group included a former real estate developer, a computer programmer, a post office worker, and a bus driver. They were ordinary people who, for a variety of personal and spiritual reasons, had become profoundly disillusioned with the modern world. They were seekers, people who were looking for a sense of purpose, a community, and a belief system that could provide answers to life's biggest questions. In Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles, they found what they were looking for. The two offered them a complete, all-encompassing cosmology, a story that explained everything from the nature of the universe to the purpose of their own lives. They offered them a family, a class of like-minded individuals who shared their sense of alienation from the outside world. And most powerfully, they offered them a sense of specialness, the belief that they were the chosen few, the elite crew who would be saved from the imminent destruction of the planet. For a person feeling lost and powerless, this narrative was incredibly seductive. The legacy of Heaven's Gate is a complex and often misunderstood one. It is frequently lumped in with other, more violent, cult tragedies like the Jonestown Massacre or the Waco Siege. But Heaven's Gate was different. Their violence was directed entirely inward. They did not engage in a violent standoff with the law. They did not harm anyone outside of their own group. They simply, quietly, and methodically chose to exit. Their story is less a story of a violent cult and more a tragic case study in the power of shared delusion and the extreme, logical conclusions of a bizarre but internally consistent belief system. The case also marked a pivotal moment in the history of the internet. Heaven's Gate was one of the very first cybercults, a group that used the new digital frontier as its primary tool for communication and recruitment. Their website, which is still maintained today by two surviving former members as a kind of digital monument, remains a fascinating and chilling artifact of the early internet age. It is a testament to the power of the internet to create and sustain isolated communities of belief, a phenomenon that has become even more pronounced in the decades since. The story of Heaven's Gate serves as a profound and unsettling cautionary tale. It is a story about the human need for meaning and the sometimes deadly paths that search can lead us down. It is a testament to the terrifying power of a charismatic leader to reshape the reality of their followers. Marshall Applewhite was a master manipulator, a man who successfully convinced 38 other people to abandon their lives, their families, and ultimately, their own survival instinct in the name of a science fiction fantasy. The 39 members of Heaven's Gate believed they were graduating to a higher plane of existence, leaving their human containers behind to board a spaceship trailing in the tail of a comet. For the rest of the world, the reality is far more tragic. They were a group of lost and searching souls who, in their quest for heaven, found only a quiet, sterile death in a suburban mansion, leaving behind only a bizarre digital legacy and a haunting, unanswered question about the nature of faith, delusion, and the human desire to believe in something more. The strange, insular world of Heaven's Gate was a community that chose to erase itself. But sometimes a mystery is not about a group, but about a single enigmatic figure, a man who appears from nowhere, dies a mysterious death, and leaves behind a single, uncrackable clue that will baffle a nation for generations. The Great Train Robbery Great Britain in the early 1960s was a nation in the midst of a profound identity crisis. The sun was finally setting on the British Empire, and the old certainties of class and deference were beginning to crumble. A new, vibrant, and rebellious youth culture was on the rise, and with it, a new kind of criminal. The post-war underworld was no longer just the domain of thuggish brutes. It was becoming more sophisticated, more ambitious, and in a strange way, more glamorous. This was the era of the gentleman thief, the cool, charismatic criminal who saw crime not just as a means to an end, but as a kind of high-stakes performance art. And in the summer of 1963, a group of these new criminals would come together to pull off a crime so audacious, so meticulously planned, and so stunningly successful that it would become a permanent part of British folklore. The Great Train Robbery. The mastermind behind this audacious plan was a man named Bruce Reynolds. Reynolds was the archetypal gentleman thief. He was handsome, intelligent, and impeccably dressed. He was a connoisseur of fine art, fast cars, and jazz music. He was also a highly successful career criminal, a man who had made a name for himself as a brilliant planner and the leader of a tight-knit crew of London-based robbers. Reynolds was not driven by desperation. He was driven by ambition. He wanted to pull off one last, spectacular job, a big one, that would set him and his crew up for life and cement his legacy as the greatest criminal mastermind of his generation. He called it his Sistine Chapel. The target he chose was as audacious as his ambition. It was the Up Special, the Glasgow to London Royal Mail train. This was no ordinary passenger train. It was a high-speed, rolling post office, a cash cow on wheels that transported money from banks all across Scotland and the north of England down to the central clearing houses in London. On a typical night, it carried a significant amount of cash. But Reynolds and his crew were targeting a very specific run. They planned to hit the train on the night of August 7th, 1963, just after a major bank holiday weekend. They knew through inside information that on this particular night, the train would be carrying an unusually large shipment of used banknotes, a haul that could be worth millions. To pull off a crime of this complexity, Reynolds needed a team of specialists. He assembled a supergroup of the London underworld, a crew of 16 men, each chosen for their specific set of skills. There was Gordon Goody, a tough and experienced robber, Charlie Wilson, the crew's imposing treasurer and enforcer, and Buster Edwards, a former boxer and nightclub owner. And then there was a man who would become the most famous and infamous member of the gang, Ronnie Biggs. At the time, Biggs was a small-time crook, a carpenter who had done time with Reynolds. He was not a major player, but he had one crucial connection. He knew a retired train driver who could be brought in to actually move the train if needed. The plan Reynolds devised was a masterpiece of low-tech, military-grade precision. They needed to stop a high-speed train in a remote, isolated location, overpower the crew, steal the money, and then vanish without a trace. They spent months planning, meticulously scouting locations along the train's route. They finally settled on a spot called Sears Crossing, a remote section of track in the Buckinghamshire countryside. At this location, there was a railway signal that was controlled from the trackside, and just a half-mile down the line was a small overpass called Burdago Bridge, a perfect, secluded spot to unload the loot. The plan was a two-stage operation. First, they would need to tamper with the railway signals to force the train to stop at their chosen location. This required a level of technical knowledge that the gang did not possess. So, Reynolds recruited an anonymous insider, a man known to history only as the Ulsterman, who provided them with the detailed technical information they needed to rig the signals. The plan was simple but ingenious. They would cover the green go signal with a leather glove, and then, using a series of batteries, they would power the red stop signal, forcing the train to halt precisely where they wanted it. The second part of the plan involved the getaway. After stopping the train and taking the money, they needed a place to lie low, to count their spoils and wait for the initial police dragnet to pass. For this, they purchased a dilapidated, isolated farmhouse about 15 miles from the robbery site. Leatherslade Farm was a perfect hideout, a remote, forgotten place surrounded by fields and a moat, accessible only by a single narrow track. It was here that they would retreat after the heist, dividing the money before melting back into their lives. On the night of August 7th, 1963, the plan was put into motion. The 16-man gang, dressed in military-style coveralls and helmets, gathered at Leatherslade Farm. They were a private army, ready for their final assault. They loaded into 2 stolen army trucks and a Land Rover and drove through the dark country lanes to Sears Crossing. They were armed with kashas and iron bars, but they had a strict rule: no firearms. Reynolds did not want a simple robbery to escalate into a murder. As they arrived at the crossing, a thick fog was beginning to settle over the countryside, providing them with an extra layer of cover. They cut the trackside telephone lines, isolating the train crew from the outside world. Then one of the men, a former electrician, climbed the signal gantry. He covered the green light and, using the batteries, illuminated the red light. The trap was set. Now all they had to do was wait. In the darkness and the fog, the 16 men took their positions, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. The Royal Mail train, a high-speed behemoth carrying a fortune, was thundering towards them through the night, completely unaware that it was about to roll into a meticulously planned ambush, the opening scene of the crime of the century. At approximately 3 a.m. on the morning of Thursday, August 8, 1963, the up-special Royal Mail train approached the rigged signal at Sears Crossing. The driver, a 58-year-old veteran named Jack Mills, saw the red light and did exactly what he was trained to do. He brought the massive 75-ton locomotive to a grinding halt. His co-driver, David Whitby, got out of the cab to call the signalman from the trackside telephone, only to find the line was dead. It was in this moment of confusion that the gang made their move. A swarm of figures emerged from the darkness and the fog, their faces obscured by ski masks and helmets. They swarmed the engine cab. David Whitby was quickly overpowered and thrown down an embankment. The gang then turned their attention to the driver, Jack Mills. A struggle ensued, and in the chaos, one of the robbers brought an iron bar down on Mills's head, striking him with a brutal, sickening force. Mills collapsed, bleeding profusely. This was the one act of serious violence during the entire heist, a direct violation of Bruce Reynolds's no-guns rule, and it would cast a dark shadow over the crime, transforming it from a daring, bloodless caper into a violent assault. With the train crew subdued, the gang now faced their first major problem. They had stopped the train at the signal, but they needed to move it half a mile down the track to Berdego Bridge, where their getaway vehicles were waiting. This was where their own train driver, the retired man brought in by Ronnie Biggs, was supposed to take over. But the retired driver, accustomed to the old steam locomotives, was completely baffled by the complex controls of the modern diesel-electric engine. He couldn't get it to move. Panic began to set in. The entire, meticulously planned operation was on the verge of collapsing due to a single, unforeseen technical failure. In a moment of high-stakes improvisation, the gang dragged the injured and dazed Jack Mills back into the cab and forced him to drive his own train to the bridge. Mills, despite his severe head injury, complied, driving the train slowly and carefully down the track until it reached the designated spot. Once at Berdego Bridge, the main assault began. The target was the second carriage behind the engine, the high-value package, HVP coach. This was a specially fortified carriage where the registered mail and the cash were stored. The gang, using axes and crowbars, tried to break in, but the carriage was designed to resist them. Inside, a handful of terrified Royal Mail sorters had barricaded themselves in, refusing to open the doors. The gang, now working against the clock, formed a human chain, passing heavy mailbags from the other carriages and piling them up against the HVP coach. But their primary focus was on the cash. The mail sorters inside, hearing the chaos and fearing for their lives, eventually surrendered. The gang stormed the carriage. Inside, they found what they were looking for: 120 mailbags filled with used banknotes. The haul was even bigger than they had anticipated. They worked with a frantic, disciplined energy, forming a human chain from the carriage, down the embankment, to the waiting army truck below. One by one, they passed the heavy, cash-filled sacks down the line. After just 20 minutes of intense labor, the truck was loaded. Their work was done. The gang jumped into their vehicles and sped off into the darkness, leaving behind a disabled train, a traumatized crew, and a terrified group of mail sorters. They had been on the scene for less than an hour. They had pulled off the most audacious robbery in British history, and they had gotten away clean. They drove the 15 miles through the dark, foggy country lanes back to their sanctuary, Leatherslade Farm. As they arrived, A sense of euphoric, almost giddy, triumph filled the air. They had done it. They had pulled off the Sistine Chapel of heists. They piled the 120 mailbags in the middle of the farmhouse floor and began the joyous task of counting their loot. The final tally was staggering. They had stolen over 2.6 million pounds, a sum equivalent to more than 50 million pounds, or roughly 65 million US dollars. Today, it was a fortune beyond their wildest dreams. They spent the next 2 days at Leatherslade Farm, celebrating, drinking, and playing a now infamous game of Monopoly using the real stolen cash. But while they were reveling in their success, a series of small, careless mistakes were being made that would ultimately lead to their downfall. Their plan had been to stay at the farm for a week, to let the initial police dragnet pass, and then to quietly disperse. But the news of the robbery was everywhere. The sheer scale of the crime had sparked the largest manhunt in British history. The gang grew paranoid. They heard planes flying overhead and became convinced the police were already closing in. In a state of panicked haste, they decided to abandon the farm early. They divided the money, each man taking his share, a sum of over 150,000 pounds each. Their original plan had been to hire a specialist, a cleaner, to come in after they left and meticulously wipe down the entire farmhouse, removing any trace of their presence. But in their panicked departure, they decided to do the job themselves. They did a cursory wipe down of the surfaces, gathered up their rubbish, and then, on the morning of August 11th, just 3 days after the robbery, they fled Leatherslade Farm, scattering in different directions. Their hasty, amateurish cleanup was a catastrophic error. They believed they had left behind a sterile scene, but they had overlooked dozens of crucial pieces of evidence. A local herdsman, noticing the unusual activity at the supposedly abandoned farm, became suspicious and alerted the police. On August 13th, just 5 days after the robbery, a detective from Buckinghamshire Police, following up on the tip, walked into Leatherslade Farm. The robbers were long gone, but their ghosts were everywhere. The detective found discarded food wrappers, sleeping bags, and, most importantly, the Monopoly board, still set up with the real money they had been playing with. But the most damning evidence they had left behind was invisible to the naked eye. The farmhouse was a treasure trove of latent fingerprints, left on everything from a ketchup bottle to the Monopoly board itself. The great train robbers had gotten away with a fortune, but in their haste to escape, they had left behind the very clues that would lead the police directly to their door. The clock was now ticking on their newfound freedom. The discovery of Leatherslade Farm was the single biggest breakthrough the police could have hoped for. The robbers, in their panicked and premature departure, had turned their perfect hideout into a forensic goldmine. The farmhouse was a time capsule of their brief, euphoric stay, and it was covered in the one thing they had tried so desperately to avoid leaving behind: evidence. The Special Task Force from Scotland Yard, known as the Flying Squad, descended on the farm and began a meticulous, inch-by-inch search. The fingerprints they lifted from the ketchup bottle, the Monopoly set, and other surfaces were a priceless gift. In an era before computerized databases, the police began the slow, painstaking process of manually comparing these prints to the millions they had on file. One by one, they started getting matches. The first positive identification came back to a man named Charlie Wilson, the gang's treasurer. Then another for Ronnie Biggs, the man who had brought the useless train driver into the crew. Soon, they had names for most of the core members of the gang. The ghosts of the robbery now had faces and criminal records. The massive manhunt, which had been a sprawling, unfocused affair, now had a series of specific, high-value targets. The arrests began to happen with stunning speed. Within a few weeks of the robbery, most of the main gang members were in custody. Charlie Wilson was apprehended after a dramatic chase. Gordon Goody was arrested at his hotel. Buster Edwards was found hiding in a loft. The police net was closing with ruthless efficiency. They recovered some of the stolen money, but a significant portion of the 2.6 million pounds had already been laundered or hidden away, a fortune that would remain lost forever. The trial of the great train robbers began in January of 1964 in Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire. It was the longest and most sensational criminal trial in British history up to that point. The public was captivated by the story of the audacious heist and the colorful cast of characters who had pulled it off. The prosecution, armed with the powerful forensic evidence from Leatherslade Farm, laid out its case. The defense attorneys for the various robbers tried to discredit the fingerprint evidence, arguing it was circumstantial and didn't prove their clients were at the scene of the actual robbery. But the evidence, combined with the sheer weight of the crime itself, was overwhelming. In the end, the jury found 11 of the men guilty. The judge, in his sentencing, was determined to make an example of them. He described the crime as a sordid crime of violence and an act of warfare against the community. He handed down extraordinarily long sentences, far exceeding what was typical for a robbery. Even one of this scale, 7 of the main conspirators, including Wilson, Goody, and Edwards, were each sentenced to 30 years in prison. The message was clear. The age of the glamorous gentleman thief was over, and the consequences for such audacious crimes would be severe. But the story of the great train robbers was far from over. The long prison sentences were not a final chapter, but the beginning of a new, even more dramatic, act of defiance. The men who had been clever enough to stop a train were also clever enough to see the weaknesses in the British prison system. In August of 1964, just a few months into his 30-year sentence, Charlie Wilson, one of the ringleaders, escaped from Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. His escape was as audacious as the robbery itself. A 3-man team broke into the prison, overpowered the guards, and sprung Wilson from his cell. He was free for 4 years before being recaptured in Canada. His escape was just a prelude. The most famous and most spectacular escape was yet to come. On July 8, 1965, Ronnie Biggs, the man who had played a relatively minor role in the heist but was now serving a 30-year sentence, made his own bid for freedom. He scaled the wall of London's Wandsworth prison using a rope ladder that had been thrown over by accomplices. He dropped into a waiting furniture van, which had been fitted with mattresses to break his fall, and disappeared. Biggs's escape would turn him from a footnote in the story into its most enduring and infamous character. He became the world's most famous fugitive. He underwent extensive plastic surgery in Paris to alter his appearance. He then fled to Australia, where he lived for several years with his wife and children under an assumed name. When the police finally caught up with him there, he managed to escape again, this time fleeing to Brazil. Brazil, at the time, had no extradition treaty with the United Kingdom for its own citizens' parents, and Biggs, in a stroke of calculated luck, had fathered a child with his Brazilian girlfriend. This legal loophole made him untouchable. For the next 3 decades, Ronnie Biggs lived a life of open, unapologetic exile in Rio de Janeiro. He became a bizarre international celebrity, a living tourist attraction. He would host parties, sell T-shirts with his image on them, and charge journalists and tourists for the privilege of hearing his story. He even recorded a song with the British punk band, the Sex Pistols. He was the charming, roguish criminal who had gotten away with it, a folk hero to some and a notorious villain to others. He had turned his crime into a career, his infamy into his brand. Meanwhile, Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, the gentleman thief who had conceived of the entire operation, had also managed to evade capture. After the robbery, he had fled the country with his family, living a life of luxury on the French Riviera and in Mexico. But the life of a fugitive, even a wealthy one, was a lonely and paranoid one. After 5 years on the run, his money was dwindling, and he was homesick. In 1968, he made the fateful decision to return to England. He was recognized and arrested almost immediately. In 1969, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The architect of the great train robbery was finally behind bars. His Sistine Chapel had been completed, but its creator would pay a heavy price. The era of the great heist was over, but the legend was just beginning to take shape. The decades following the great train robbery saw the slow, inevitable decline of the men who had once been the kings of the London underworld. While Ronnie Biggs was living a life of celebrity exile in Brazil, his former colleagues were serving out their long, hard sentences in British prisons. The immense fortune they had stolen did little to secure them a happy future. The money, for many, proved to be a curse, a source of paranoia, betrayal, and ultimately, ruin. Much of it was never recovered, having been squandered, laundered through complex channels, or hidden away in secret accounts that were lost with the passage of time. Bruce Reynolds, the mastermind, was released from prison in 1978 after serving 10 years. He emerged into a world that had completely changed. The swinging London of his heyday was gone, replaced by a grittier, more cynical era. He was a man out of time, his reputation as a criminal genius now a historical footnote. He struggled to find his place, working briefly as a consultant and writing his memoirs, but he never regained the glamour or the wealth of his former life. He lived his final years in quiet obscurity in a modest flat in South London, a far cry from the lavish lifestyle he had once enjoyed. He died in 2013, a frail old man, the last of the great gentleman thieves. Buster Edwards, the former boxer, was also released after serving his sentence. He tried to go straight, running a small flower stall outside London's Waterloo Station. But he was a man haunted by his past and by the pressures of his notoriety. He struggled with depression and, in 1994, he was found dead in his home, a victim of suicide. His story was a tragic testament to the fact that getting away with the crime did not mean escaping its consequences. The most famous of them all, Ronnie Biggs, eventually saw his life of tropical exile come to an end. In 2001, at the age of 71 and in failing health after a series of strokes, he made the voluntary decision to return to the United Kingdom. His motives were a mix of nostalgia, a desire to receive proper medical care from the National Health Service, and perhaps a final dramatic act in his long public performance. He was immediately arrested upon his arrival and sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his 30-year sentence. He was eventually released on compassionate grounds in 2009 due to his severe ill health. He died in a nursing home in 2013, his death marking the end of a truly bizarre and improbable life. The one figure in the story who remains a complete and total mystery is the Ulsterman, the anonymous insider who provided the crucial technical information about the railway signals. He was the man who made the entire robbery possible, yet his identity has never been revealed. He was reportedly paid a share of the loot and then simply vanished, a ghost in the machine who was never caught and never identified. He is the great, unsolved puzzle at the heart of the great train robbery, a testament to the fact that even in one of the most famous and heavily investigated crimes in history, some secrets can be kept forever. The legacy of the great train robbery is a profound and complex one. It was a crime that marked a turning point in British society. It was the last great act of the old-style, glamorous criminals, a final, audacious flourish before the underworld became dominated by more brutal, less theatrical forms of organized crime like the drug trade. The sheer scale and success of the robbery forced a complete overhaul of security procedures for the Royal Mail and the British railway system. But its most powerful legacy is a cultural one. The crime has been endlessly mythologized, the subject of numerous films, books, and documentaries. The robbers themselves, particularly figures like Reynolds, Edwards, and Biggs, were transformed into folk heroes, working-class lads who had taken on the establishment and won. They became symbols of a rebellious, anti-authoritarian spirit that resonated deeply with the changing attitudes of the 1960s. The public was, in many ways, rooting for them, captivated by their audacity and their ability to outwit the authorities. This romanticized view, however, has always existed in tension with the grim reality of the crime. The brutal attack on the train driver, Jack Mills, was a detail that could never be fully washed away by the glamour of the heist. Mills never fully recovered from his head injuries. He was unable to work again and suffered from severe trauma for the rest of his life. He died a few years later from an unrelated illness, but his family has always maintained that his spirit was broken on that foggy night at Sears Crossing. He is the forgotten victim of the great train robbery, a permanent, tragic reminder that even a bloodless caper can have a profound and devastating human cost. Today, the great train robbery stands as a landmark in the history of crime. It was a crime of its time, a product of a specific moment in British history, but it is also a timeless story of ambition, greed, and the complex, often contradictory, nature of our relationship with crime and its perpetrators. It is a story that reminds us that sometimes the most successful criminals are not the ones who get away with it, but the ones who are clever enough to turn their own crime into a legend that will outlive them. The Great Train Robbery was a meticulously planned heist that netted a fortune. But not all crimes are so clean. Some are acts of pure, nihilistic terror, designed not for profit, but to sow fear and chaos, leaving behind a trail of dead and a city paralyzed by the actions of a single, unseen predator. The disappearance of A.C. Sonny Liston in the brutal, smoke-filled world of 20th century professional boxing. Few figures have ever cast a shadow as long or as menacing as that of Charles Sonny Liston. He was more than just a heavyweight champion. He was a force of nature, a physical embodiment of raw, intimidating power, with a scowl that seemed to be permanently etched onto his face, a thunderous 18-inch fist, and a silent, brooding presence that could unnerve an opponent before a single punch was thrown. Liston was the man the boxing world both feared and, in a strange way, needed. He was the ultimate villain, the Big Bear, the monster who came from the dark side of the tracks to dominate the sport's most glamorous division. But the source of his power was also the source of his ultimate tragedy. His career was not his own. It was a property, an asset controlled and manipulated by the most powerful and dangerous men in the country. The American Mafia, and the story of his life, and his mysterious, lonely death, is a story of a man who could defeat any opponent in the ring, but could never escape the invisible masters who pulled his strings. Sonny Liston's story begins not in the bright lights of a boxing arena, but in the deep, grinding poverty of rural Arkansas. Born into a family of sharecroppers with over 24 siblings, his childhood was a relentless litany of hardship and abuse. He never knew his exact birth date. He was illiterate for his entire life. He was beaten by his father, a man he would later describe as the cruelest person he had ever known. To escape this life, he ran away as a teenager, making his way to St. Louis, where his size and his simmering rage quickly led him down a path of street crime and violence. It was a path that would inevitably lead him to prison. But it was in the Missouri State Penitentiary, while serving time for armed robbery, that Sonny Liston found his calling. A prison chaplain, who also ran the athletic program, saw the raw, untamed power in the young inmate and encouraged him to take up boxing. In the ring, Liston's rage found a purpose. His immense natural strength and his seemingly limitless capacity for absorbing punishment made him a terrifying and unbeatable force. Upon his release from prison, his talent was immediately noticed by the men who controlled the boxing world in St. Louis. These were not legitimate promoters. They were mobsters. The world of professional boxing in the 1950s was deeply, inextricably linked to organized crime. The sport was a massive, unregulated cash cow, a perfect vehicle for illegal gambling, money laundering, and fight fixing. The two most powerful figures in this world were Frankie Carbo, a senior member of the Lucchese crime family, and his associate, Frank Blinky Palermo. They, along with a network of local enforcers, effectively owned the sport. They controlled the fighters, the promoters, the venues, and often the outcomes of the fights themselves. For a young, uneducated, and powerful ex-convict like Sonny Liston to have a career, he had no choice but to sign his life over to them. Liston's contract was owned by some of the most notorious gangsters in St. Louis and, by extension, by Carbo and Palermo. They became his managers, his promoters, and his keepers. They provided him with the fights, the training, and a small stipend to live on. In return, they took the lion's share of his earnings. He was their prized fighter, their horse in the heavyweight division, and under their ruthless management, his rise through the ranks was meteoric and brutal. He was a terrifying presence in the ring. He fought with a sullen, almost bored ferocity, dispatching his opponents with a powerful, punishing jab and a knockout punch that was one of the most feared in the history of the sport. He was not a flashy or elegant boxer. He was a machine of pure destruction. He quickly cleaned out the heavyweight division, defeating every top contender who was put in front of him. But his success came with a dark cloud of suspicion. His connections to the mob were an open secret. Many of his fights were believed to be fixed, his opponents either paid or intimidated into taking a dive. The public and the press saw him not as a heroic athlete, but as a mob enforcer in boxing gloves, a terrifying symbol of the criminal element that had corrupted the sweet science. By the early 1960s, there was only one man left for him to fight, the reigning heavyweight champion, Floyd Patterson. Patterson was everything Liston was not. He was a quiet, sensitive man, a devout Catholic, and a champion who was beloved by the public. He was seen as the good champion, the clean-living hero standing against the dark, corrupting force that Liston represented. The boxing establishment and the White House itself were terrified of the prospect of a man like Sonny Liston, an illiterate ex-convict with direct ties to the mafia, becoming the heavyweight champion of the world. The title was more than just a belt. It was a symbol of American strength and virtue, and Liston was seen as a threat to that symbol. But Liston's dominance was undeniable. He was the #1 contender, and he could not be denied his shot. The fight was set for September 25, 1962, in Chicago. The build-up was a classic good versus evil narrative. Patterson was the hero. Liston was the villain. The fight itself was a shocking and brutal anticlimax. Sonny Liston, with his terrifying power, demolished Floyd Patterson in the very first round, knocking him out in just over 2 minutes. The monster had won. The mob's champion, the man the establishment had feared so deeply, was now the heavyweight champion of the world. His victory was met not with celebration, but with a sense of unease and dread. He was the most powerful and the most feared man in sports, but he was also a pariah, an outcast champion who was seen as a disgrace to the title. He had reached the pinnacle of his profession, but he was still a prisoner, a man whose life and career were owned and controlled by the very people who had made his rise possible. He had the crown, but it was a crown of thorns, and the men who had placed it on his head would soon be the ones to order its removal, in a fight that would be even more controversial and more mysterious than the one that had made him a king. The stage was being set for a confrontation with a young, brash challenger who would not only take his title, but would change the world of sports forever. Sonny Liston's reign as the heavyweight champion was a joyless and short-lived one. He was the most dominant fighter on the planet, but he was a champion without a kingdom. The public reviled him, the press demonized him, and the boxing establishment held him at arm's length. He was a king in exile, a brooding, lonely figure who seemed to be trapped by his own fearsome reputation. In the background, his mob handlers continued to pull the strings, managing his career and skimming the vast majority of his earnings. His first title defense was a contractually obligated rematch with Floyd Patterson, which ended in almost the exact same way as the first fight, a brutal first-round knockout. Liston was simply too powerful, too intimidating for the sensitive Patterson. With Patterson dispatched, a new challenger emerged, a young, impossibly handsome, and endlessly charismatic fighter from Louisville, Kentucky. He was a recent Olympic gold medalist, a poet, a prophet of self-love, and a master of psychological warfare. His name was Cassius Clay. To the boxing world, Clay was seen as a joke, a fast-talking but untested upstart who had no chance against the monstrous power of Sonny Liston. The fight, scheduled for February 25, 1964, in Miami Beach, was considered a mismatch of epic proportions. The Las Vegas betting odds were 7-1 against Clay. The fight was seen as little more than a public execution, but Cassius Clay had a plan. He understood that the key to beating Sonny Liston was not to outpunch him, but to outthink him, to get inside his head and shatter his aura of invincibility. In the weeks leading up to the fight, Clay launched a relentless campaign of psychological warfare. He followed Liston everywhere, taunting him, rhyming at him, calling him a big, ugly bear. He showed up at Liston's training camp in the middle of the night with a busload of supporters, screaming insults. At the official weigh-in, he put on a legendary performance of feigned madness, his heart rate soaring as he screamed at Liston, "You're a chump! You're a chump!" Many in the press and even the fight commission doctors believed he was having a genuine hysterical breakdown, that he was literally terrified out of his mind. But it was all a brilliant act, a piece of theater designed to unnerve the stoic, silent champion. And it worked. Liston, a man who was used to his opponents being paralyzed with fear, was completely baffled by this strange, loud, and seemingly insane young man. For the first time, he was the one who was being psychologically intimidated. The fight itself was a masterpiece of strategy and skill on Clay's part. He used his incredible speed and footwork to stay away from Liston's powerful jab, dancing around the ring, peppering the champion with quick, stinging combinations. Liston, the flat-footed slugger, couldn't catch him. He was chasing a ghost. By the end of the third round, a large welt had appeared under Liston's eye. The big, ugly bear was being outboxed, outthought, and humiliated. Then, at the start of the fifth round, a new and strange drama unfolded. Clay came out of his corner complaining that he couldn't see, that something was burning in his eyes. He screamed for his corner man, Angelo Dundee, to cut off his gloves, that he couldn't continue. Dundee, in a moment of brilliant ringside management, pushed him back into the ring, telling him to run. It has long been suspected that Liston's corner had deliberately applied a blinding substance to his gloves, a common dirty trick of the era. For most of the round, Clay was effectively blind, using his instincts and his speed to survive Liston's desperate assault. By the sixth round, his vision had cleared, and he resumed his dominance. At the end of the round, Liston, slumped on his stool, his face swollen, his shoulder apparently injured, did the unthinkable. He quit. He refused to come out for the seventh round. The most intimidating man in boxing, the unbeatable monster, had surrendered on his stool. Cassius Clay, the 7-1 underdog, was the new heavyweight champion of the world. He leaped to the center of the ring, screaming at the press who had dismissed him, "I am the greatest. I shook up the world." The result was a profound shock to the entire sports world. But behind the shock were the dark, persistent whispers of a fix. Had the fight been legitimate? Or had the mob, who had a significant financial interest in the bout, ordered their champion to take a dive? A victory for the underdog Clay would have resulted in a massive gambling windfall for anyone who had bet against the heavy favorite. Sonny Liston, a man whose entire career had been defined by his mob connections, was now at the center of a new and even more damning controversy. A rematch was inevitable. It was scheduled for May 25, 1965, in the small town of Lewiston, Maine. In the interim, Cassius Clay had shocked the world again, announcing that he had joined the Nation of Islam and had changed his name. He was now Muhammad Ali. The rematch was not just a fight. It was a culture clash, a moment of profound social and political significance. The fight itself would become one of the most controversial and infamous events in the history of sports. Just moments into the first round, Ali threw a short, seemingly harmless-looking right hand that glanced off the side of Liston's head. It was a punch that no one at ringside even seemed to see, but Liston collapsed to the canvas as if he had been shot. He rolled over, then lay flat on his back, his arms outstretched. The moment was captured in one of the most iconic photographs in sports history. A triumphant, enraged Muhammad Ali standing over his fallen opponent, screaming at him, "Get up and fight, you bum! Get up and fight!" The scene descended into chaos. The referee, the legendary Jersey Joe Walcott, seemed to lose control of the count. Ali danced around the ring, refusing to go to a neutral corner. Liston eventually struggled to his feet, and the fight briefly resumed before Walcott, informed by the ringside timekeeper that the 10 count had long since passed, finally stopped the fight. Muhammad Ali had won by a first-round knockout. The punch that had ended the fight would forever be known as the Phantom Punch, a blow so seemingly insignificant that it has been debated and analyzed for over 50 years. Was it a legitimate knockout? Or was this, once again, a fixed fight, a clear and blatant dive by a fighter who was taking orders from his mob masters? The slow-motion replays are inconclusive. Some say Ali's punch, while short, was incredibly fast and perfectly timed, a perfect punch that caught Liston on the chin and scrambled his equilibrium. Others, including many boxing insiders, are convinced that Liston took a dive. They believe the mob, having made a fortune on the first fight, was now cashing in on the rematch. Sonny Liston, the man who had once been their greatest asset, was now being used to settle their gambling debts. his career and his legacy sacrificed at the altar of their greed. For the second time in a row, the man who was once the most feared fighter on the planet had been defeated under a cloud of deep and enduring suspicion. His time at the top was over, and his slow, tragic descent into a world of debt, fear, and ultimately a mysterious death had begun. The two humiliating and deeply suspicious losses to Muhammad Ali effectively ended Sonny Liston's career as a major force in the heavyweight division. He became a pariah, a man forever tainted by the specter of fixed fights. The mob, having used him to make a fortune in the two Ali bouts, largely cast him aside. He was no longer their prized champion. He was a diminished and tarnished asset. Stripped of his title and his fearsome reputation, Liston embarked on a long, slow, and ultimately tragic comeback trail, fighting a series of lesser-known opponents in small venues across the country and in Europe. He was still a powerful and dangerous fighter, and he won most of these bouts, but he was a ghost of his former self, a king without a kingdom, haunted by the whispers and the unanswered questions that surrounded his two most famous defeats. In the late 1960s, seeking a fresh start and a place where he could live in relative anonymity, Liston moved to Las Vegas, Nevada. At the time, Las Vegas was a city that was, in many ways, a perfect reflection of Liston's own life. It was a glittering, glamorous oasis on the surface, but its foundations were built on the dark, hidden money of the very mobsters who had controlled his career. It was a place where a man with a past could disappear, a city of second chances and last resorts. Liston settled into a comfortable, upper-middle-class home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He tried to live a normal life. He was known in his community as a surprisingly gentle and quiet man, a stark contrast to his fearsome public persona. He was friendly with his neighbors, often giving out autographs and posing for pictures. He had a deep, almost pathological, fear of needles, a detail that would become critically important in the investigation of his death. But the shadows of his past were never far behind. He was still deeply in debt to his former mob associates, and to make ends meet, he was forced to work on the fringes of the Las Vegas underworld. He took a job as a greeter at the Sands Hotel and Casino, a position that was, in reality, a form of low-level muscle work for the casino's mob-connected owners. He was also rumored to be involved in loan sharking and working as a leg breaker for local gangsters, using his still intimidating presence to collect on unpaid debts. His life in Las Vegas was a web of contradictions. He was a beloved local celebrity and a feared mob enforcer. He was a quiet, friendly neighbor who was also involved in a dangerous and violent criminal underworld. And he was a man who was desperately trying to make one last legitimate comeback in the boxing ring. By 1970, he was on a winning streak, and there was talk of a potential title shot against the then-champion, Joe Frazier. It was a long shot, a flicker of hope in a life that was increasingly defined by desperation. But as the year drew to a close, Liston seemed to be a man in a state of growing anxiety. He was reportedly terrified of someone, though he never told his wife, Geraldine, or his friends who it was. He was scheduled to fight a journeyman boxer named Chuck Wepner in June of 1970, a fight he was expected to win easily. Before the bout, he was visited by a group of his old mob associates. The nature of their conversation is unknown, but it has long been speculated that they were there to deliver a message or an order. Liston went on to win the fight against Wepner, but it was a brutal, bloody affair that left his opponent with over 70 stitches. It would be the last fight of his life. In the final weeks of 1970, the sense of dread surrounding Sonny Liston seemed to intensify. He was involved in a car accident, and he told his wife that he believed someone was trying to kill him. He began to talk about getting out of Las Vegas, of leaving the country. He seemed to be a man who knew he was trapped, a man who was running out of time. The last time his wife, Geraldine, saw him alive was on December 30th, 1970. She was leaving for a few days to visit her mother in St. Louis for the New Year's holiday. She left him at their home, preparing a meal. When she returned to Las Vegas nearly a week later, on January 5th, 1971, she was met with a scene of strange, eerie silence. The newspapers were piling up on the front porch. The milk bottles had not been brought in. A knot of fear formed in her stomach. She used her key to open the front door and was immediately hit by a foul, overpowering odor. She called her husband's name, but there was no answer. The house was dark and still. As she made her way through the house, she followed the smell to the master bedroom. She pushed open the door and found him. Sonny Liston was lying on his back at the foot of their bed, dressed only in a t-shirt and boxer shorts. He was dead. His body was bloated and in a state of decomposition, suggesting he had been dead for several days. On the nightstand beside the bed, police would find a small amount of marijuana, some vodka, and a syringe. The initial investigation into the death of the former heavyweight champion was, by many accounts, surprisingly cursory. The police seemed quick to accept a simple, straightforward explanation for a death that was anything but. The official cause of death was ruled as a heroin overdose. The coroner's report stated that Liston had died of lung congestion and that fresh needle marks were found on his arm. The death was officially ruled as accidental, the tragic but not entirely unexpected end for a man with a long and troubled history. But for those who knew Sonny Liston, this explanation made no sense at all. The man who was so terrified of needles that he would refuse routine medical injections had supposedly died by injecting himself with heroin? It seemed completely out of character. Furthermore, the amount of heroin found in his system was not enough to be considered a definitively lethal dose, especially for a man of his immense size. And while there were needle marks on his arm, there was no other drug paraphernalia found at the scene. No spoon, no lighter, no tourniquet, none of the tools typically used by a heroin user. The official story was full of holes, and it ignored the most compelling question of all. If Sonny Liston, one of the most feared men in the country, had not injected himself, then who had? The scene in the bedroom, with its strange lack of paraphernalia and its conveniently placed syringe, felt staged. It looked less like a tragic accident and more like a carefully managed murder scene. A hot shot delivered by someone he knew and trusted. A death designed to look like a self-inflicted overdose. The most famous bad man in sports had died a lonely, squalid, and deeply mysterious death. And the official explanation seemed to be the one thing that no one who knew him could ever believe. The question was not if he was murdered, but who had done it and why. The official ruling of an accidental heroin overdose as the cause of Sonny Liston's death has never been widely accepted by his family, his friends, or the many journalists and investigators who have examined the case. The theory of murder, while never proven in a court of law, has become the dominant and most compelling narrative of his final days. The list of potential suspects is long and reads like a who's who of the American underworld, a testament to the dangerous and complicated life he led. The central question is not if he was murdered, but which of his many powerful and dangerous associates finally decided he was more valuable dead than alive. The most prominent theory is that Liston was murdered by the mob. This theory has several potential motives. The first is financial. Liston was reportedly supposed to take a dive in his final fight against Chuck Wepner, but had refused, costing his mob handlers a significant amount of money in a fixed bet. His murder, then, was a brutal act of retribution for his defiance. Another, related theory is that Liston, who was deeply in debt and tired of being the mob's enforcer, was planning to testify against his former masters. He had been subpoenaed to appear before a grand jury investigating organized crime in sports, and the mob may have decided to silence him permanently before he had a chance to talk. A more specific version of this theory points to a single powerful figure, a man named Ash Resnick. Resnick was a notorious Las Vegas casino executive and a major mob associate with deep ties to both the Chicago outfit and the Cleveland mob. He was one of the men who had a piece of Liston. The theory goes that Liston was involved in a loan sharking operation run by Resnick, and that a dispute over money had arisen between them. A well-known Las Vegas police informant named Larry Gandy claimed years later that he had been hired by Resnick to kill Liston. Gandy said he went to Liston's house, but found him already dead. This story, while unproven, adds to the mountain of circumstantial evidence suggesting that Liston's death was a professional hit, ordered by the very men who had once been his biggest supporters. Another compelling theory centers on the world of drug trafficking. In his final years, Liston was rumored to have become involved with a dangerous crew of drug dealers in Las Vegas. He was allegedly using his connections to help them move heroin. In this scenario, a deal had gone wrong or Liston had become a liability, and his new criminal partners had decided to eliminate him. This would explain the presence of heroin at the scene, not as the cause of an accidental overdose, but as the signature of the people responsible for his death. And then there is the theory that his death was connected, in a strange and roundabout way, to the single most controversial moment of his career, the phantom punch against Muhammad Ali. Some have suggested that Liston, haunted by the public shame of the two fixed fights, was considering going public with the truth about the mob's control over the sport and the details of how the fights had been orchestrated. This would have been an act of betrayal that the mob could not have tolerated. His death, then, was a final, brutal act of silencing to protect the secrets of one of the biggest scandals in sports history. Each of these theories is plausible, and they are not mutually exclusive. Sonny Liston, in his final years, was a man trapped in a web of dangerous connections. He was in debt to multiple factions of the mob, he was involved in local criminal enterprises, and he held secrets that could have brought down some of the most powerful men in the country. He had, in essence, made himself a target for a dozen different reasons. His murder was not a matter of a single motive, but of a man whose life had become so compromised and so dangerous that his death was almost an inevitability. The legacy of Sonny Liston is one of tragedy and profound what-ifs. He was a man of immense natural talent, a fighter who, in a different era or under different circumstances, might have become one of the greatest and most celebrated heavyweight champions of all time. But he was a product of a brutal and unforgiving environment, a man whose life was defined by the systems of poverty, crime, and corruption that controlled him from his childhood to his grave. He was never truly a free man. He was an asset, a piece of property, a force of nature that was harnessed and exploited by men who saw him not as a human being, but as a commodity. He remains a ghost in the history of boxing, a figure of immense power and equally immense pathos. He is remembered for his terrifying scowl, for the two phantom losses to Ali, and for the deep, enduring mystery of his death. He was the champion that America never wanted, the villain whose story lacked a final act of redemption. His life was a testament to the dark side of the American dream, a story of a man who rose from the absolute depths of poverty to the pinnacle of fame, only to find that the same forces that had lifted him up were the ones that would ultimately drag him back down into the darkness. The mystery of his death will likely never be officially solved. The men who may have ordered his killing and the man who may have administered the final, fatal dose are almost certainly dead themselves. The secrets of that lonely death in a Las Vegas bedroom are buried with them. All that remains is the story of the Big Bear, the feared and tragic champion, a man who was owned by the mob, dethroned by a legend, and who died a mysterious, ignominious death, leaving behind only questions and a legacy as complex and as powerful as his famous, devastating jab. The mystery of Sonny Liston's death is a story of a man who knew too much, a single life extinguished to protect the secrets of a powerful organization. But some crimes are not so targeted. They are a form of mass terror, where the victims are chosen at random, and the weapon is not a needle, but an everyday product found in millions of medicine cabinets across the nation.